Hey folks, Brian here again with the Word Above All channel. Let's dig into Romans 12 verse 3. We've slowed it way down. We're only taking one verse a study, but let's take a look at verse 3. Paul says, "For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith." So, Paul has exhorted believers to unconditional surrender in verse 1, and then he exhorts them to be transformed by the renewing of their minds in verse 2. Now when we come to verse 3, Paul has a negative command and then a positive command, exactly the same thing he did in verse 2. So first, the negative command. He says, "Do not think more highly of yourself than you ought to think." Now the very first thing he says is, "For through the grace given to me." Now, what's he doing here? Paul is about to bring a strong reproof or rebuke to the church in Rome. He's never visited this church, so what gives him the right to rebuke the church for spiritual pride if he hasn't even been there, if he doesn't know the people? Well, Paul here is saying it's through the grace given to me. It's through the apostleship that God has called me to that I'm bringing you this strong word. This is not the insights of my natural intellect, my natural brilliance. No, this is wisdom given to me through the grace of God. And then he says, "I say to everyone among you." This was not just for a few of the people in Rome. This was not for a minority group of the Christians there who just happen to have a problem with pride. No, this word is for every believer because all of us have been infected with the evil of pride. And then he says, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think. Do you have any doubt that we often think too highly of ourselves? Well, if you do, think about this. Why are we so quick to criticize the faults of others when we have the same faults in ourselves? We're so hard on other people and we're so easy on ourselves. We let ourselves off the hook while we hold others to a higher standard. That tells us that we think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. Well, then here's the question. How ought we to think about ourselves? Let's just pull up some passages of scripture that might help us to think biblically about ourselves. Luke 17, verse 10, Jesus says, "So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, 'We are unworthy slaves. We have only done that which we ought to have done.'" Or John 15:5, Jesus taught, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." Or 1 Corinthians 15:10, Paul says, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am." Or 1 Corinthians 4:7, "For who regards you as superior? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it?" Or 1 Corinthians 3:6 and 7, "I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So then neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth." So let's sum up some of this biblical teaching on how we ought to view ourselves. We are unworthy slaves who have only done what we ought to have done. Apart from Jesus Christ, we can't do anything. It's only by the grace of God that we are what we are. In addition to that, all that we have is simply what we have received. And if we received, why do we go about thinking and boasting as if we had not received it? And then it's not the one who waters or the one who plants is anything. No, the one who does all is God. He's the one that gives actual growth. So this is how the Bible sums up our position about ourselves. Well, let's turn to the positive command then. Paul says, "But think so as to have sound judgment." The word sound means healthy. The word judgment is talking about decisions or opinions. So if we are to have healthy opinions or decisions in our life, we need to do something. Now, God doesn't want us to lie and say we have no faith or no spiritual gifts when we really do. That would be lying. That's not to have sound judgment. To have sound judgment is to reflect on the idea that God has allotted to each of us a measure of faith. He's allotted to me a certain measure. He's allotted to you a certain measure. So how do we form these sound judgments about ourselves? We reflect on the measure of faith that God has allotted to us. You say, Brian, won't that promote pride? If I'm thinking about how much faith I have, won't that make me proud of how much faith I have and say, well, I'm better than this guy because I have more faith than he does? Well, no, it won't do that, because faith is a self-emptying grace. Faith looks away from itself to Christ. Faith trusts in another rather than itself. So the more faith you have, the more need, you're saying, the more need I have to look away from myself to somebody else. It's not going to fill me with pride. It's going to fill me with adoration for the one whom my faith is in. And then secondly, we need to understand that faith is a gift in Scripture. This verse right here says, as each one has been allotted a measure of faith. The word allotted tells us that God has given each believer a certain measure or standard or amount of faith. So it comes from God. I didn't dream this up. I didn't conjure up any faith. God is the one who granted that faith to me. So, in conclusion, let's just consider the saying of a very wise Christian. He once said, humility is not thinking less of ourselves. Humility is thinking of ourselves less. Very wise counsel. It's to be a selfless individual. It's not always puffing myself up and thinking about how good or how great I am compared to somebody else. It's not even thinking of myself at all. It's thinking about God and Christ and how I can serve others and strengthen His church.